The silence was the first thing to get to us, but the darkness was what let it in. They say it was a citywide blackout, a freak storm that knocked out the power grid for hundreds of miles. People talked about it for weeks, the sheer inconvenience of it all. But I know better. The darkness didn't come from the sky that night. It came from somewhere else entirely, and it brought something with it. It was the kind of darkness that felt heavy, almost tangible, and it wasn't empty at all. My name is Alex, and my wife, Sarah, and I lived in a quiet, suburban home with our young son, Leo. Our life was ordinary, predictable. We had a dog, a mortgage, and a routine. The night it happened was a typical Friday evening. The rain had been coming down for hours, a steady, relentless drumming against the windows, and the wind howled around the eaves of the house. We had a fire going in the fireplace, the warm, flickering light providing a cozy counterpoint to the raging storm outside. Leo, our 4-year-old, was watching a movie on the couch, and Sarah and I were just enjoying the quiet time. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, and then, without warning, the world went out. The television went black, the lights died, and the sound of the furnace fan ceased with a final, dying whimper. For a moment, the only sound was the storm and the fire in the hearth. A true, complete blackout. The initial reaction was one of mild annoyance, mixed with the strange novelty of it all. We laughed, pulled out our camping flashlights, and lit a few candles. Leo thought it was an adventure, a game of hide and seek in the dark. But, as the minutes stretched into an hour, the feeling of a shared experience began to fray at the edges. The candles cast long dancing shadows that seemed to swallow the corners of every room. The storm outside provided a cover for other noises, sounds that weren't quite right. A faint, shuffling sound from the hallway, a dragging noise from the kitchen. We dismissed it, of course. Just the house settling, I said to Sarah, more to reassure myself than her. But the house didn't settle like that. It sounded like something was moving. That's when Leo started. He was sitting on the floor with his little toy cars, but his eyes were fixed on the doorway leading to the dining room. "Daddy," he whispered, "the man is watching me." I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there but dancing shadows. I tried to calm him, telling him it was just the firelight, but he insisted. "No, he's tall. He's standing there." We picked him up, held him close, and told him it was just his imagination. But the seed of terror had been planted. The sounds became more deliberate, more frequent. We were all huddled in the living room, the single flashlight beam, a pathetic shield against the overwhelming black. From the top of the stairs, we heard a deep, resonant sigh, like a lung emptying after holding its breath for far too long. It was a sound that had no business being in our home. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles turning white, and Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. We heard a low, scraping noise from the kitchen, like someone dragging a heavy box across the floor, but we didn't own anything that sounded like that. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized these were not random noises. They were an oral presence, something moving with intent inside our home. My wife Sarah was staring at the hallway again, her body rigid. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing. "What is it?" I whispered. She just shook her head, unable to speak, but her eyes were wide with a silent terror. "I saw a shadow," she finally managed, "a tall, thin shadow at the end of the hall. It was just standing there." I shone the flashlight, and in its beam, there was nothing but the dusty wall. But the fear in her eyes was real. It had been standing there, just out of our sight, and it had been watching us. We hadn't been alone in the house since the power went out. The final escalation of terror came when the entity began to speak. We were sitting together on the couch, our son held tight between us. The silence broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the next room and the occasional rumble of thunder. Sarah had just calmed Leo down. I heard a voice whisper my name from the kitchen. "Alex," it said, the sound low, raspy, and terribly close. "Come here." The blood drained from my face. It was my wife's voice. The timbre was perfect, the tone, a soft beckoning. I looked at Sarah, whose head was buried in Leo's hair, her body trembling. Did you say something?" I asked, my voice a hollow whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "No," she mouthed. The sound came again, this time a little louder, a little more insistent. "Alex?" The voice was coming from the kitchen, just yards away. It wasn't an echo, and it wasn't a trick of the mind. It was a lie, a perfect, sinister imitation, and it wanted me to come closer. The whispering from the kitchen turned into a low, menacing growl, a guttural sound that didn't belong to a human or an animal. I heard the shuffling footsteps, which were now a quick, deliberate pace, moving from the kitchen toward the living room. Sarah pulled Leo tighter against her, burying his head in her shoulder. I aimed the flashlight at the entrance to the living room, my hand shaking so violently the beam bounced like a manic ball of light. I heard my son let out a piercing scream and point toward the corner of the room, behind the couch. "The man, he's here." In the brief, flickering light of a candle that was about to burn out, I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure standing in the doorway, its form a tangle of long, thin limbs, its head slightly too large, with two glowing white eyes that seemed to burn a hole through the darkness. It didn't move like a human. Its limbs seemed to bend at impossible angles, its posture a grotesque parody of a person standing at rest. It was a creature of the blackout, a living absence of light. It took a single, shuffling step into the room, and as it did, the candle flame gave a final gasp and died, plunging us into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight in a blind panic, guided only by the sound of my wife's whimpering. I grabbed Leo and Sarah and stumbled toward the back door. We ran out into the pouring rain, barefoot and terrified, without a thought for anything but escape. We got in the car, and I drove 4 hours, not stopping until we saw the first streetlights of a city that had not been affected by the blackout. The power eventually came back on in our town, but we never returned to that house. The experience left us irrevocably changed. I live in a constant state of anxiety, jumping at every flickering light, every unusual sound, every shadow that seems a little too deep. I now know that the darkness isn't just an absence of light. It's a presence, a doorway, and something had walked right through it, right into my home, and I know, with a chilling certainty, that the next blackout won't be an inconvenience. It will be an invitation. The thing about being alone in the dark isn't just the fear of what you can't see. It's the fear of what you can't hear. When the power went out that night, the sudden silence wasn't empty. It felt thick, almost heavy, and I realized with a profound dread that it was listening. It was watching, and that's when it started to play with me. It was a game I didn't know I was in, and it had been toying with me long before I knew it was there. My name is Clara, and I had just moved into a new apartment in a high-rise building. It was a big change from my small, suburban home, and I was still getting used to the strange noises of city life. The constant hum of the air conditioning, the distant sirens, the muffled sounds of my neighbors' lives through the thin walls. My boyfriend was away on a business trip, so I had the place to myself. I'm a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters. The blackout, when it happened, was a mere inconvenience. It was a normal spring evening, and a sudden, violent storm had rolled in, knocking out the power grid. I was reading a book, a blanket wrapped around me, when everything went dark. I remember the exact moment of silence. The sudden absence of the city's hum was a shock. I fumbled for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and lit a few candles. My apartment was now an island of flickering light in a sea of complete blackness, 40 stories above the ground. It should have felt safe. It should have felt cozy, but it didn't. The first strange event was so subtle I almost dismissed it. I was in the living room, trying to read by candlelight, when I heard a soft thump from the other side of the room. I looked up, and a small framed photo of my boyfriend and me that had been sitting on a shelf was now on the floor. It had been sitting there for weeks, perfectly balanced. I figured it was just the wind from a window I hadn't properly latched, or a slight tremor in the building. I walked over, picked it up, and saw that the glass was cracked, not shattered, but a single, strange hairline fracture running right through my face in the picture. The feeling of unease was a small, cold knot in my stomach. I carefully placed the photo back on the shelf, thinking nothing more of it. But a few minutes later, I heard a faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the kitchen. It was too high up to be a mouse. It was coming from the upper cabinets. I grabbed my phone and shone the flashlight, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet kitchen, eerily lit by my phone's beam. I returned to the living room, and that's when I saw it. Another framed photo, this one, of me alone, was now on the floor. The glass was cracked, just like the other one, but this time, the crack was in the shape of a crooked smile. The paranoia began to gnaw at me. I started hearing what sounded like someone walking quickly in the hallway outside my apartment door. It wasn't a normal walking pace. It was a strange, hurried scuttling, a light, tapping footfall that was too fast to be human. I pressed my ear to the door, listening intently, but all I heard was the muffled, profound silence of the empty hall. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The sounds were no longer external. I began to hear what sounded like my own movements, perfectly mimicked, coming from the next room. A soft, deliberate tap on my shoulder when I knew I was alone. A whisper that sounded exactly like my own voice, saying my name from the kitchen. I began to question my own sanity, but the evidence of the moving photos, of the cracking glass, was undeniable. This was not in my head. Something was in the apartment with me, and it was playing a game. The terror reached a fever pitch when I received a call. My phone buzzed, a jarring sound in the stillness of the apartment. It was my boyfriend's number. My heart leaped with relief. I answered, a frantic, "Hello, are you okay? Where are you?" Ready to spill out? But all I heard was a strange, distorted, and raspy laugh on the other end, followed by a slow, deliberate whisper that sounded exactly like my own voice. "I'm in here with you, Clara." The call cut out. The entity was not just in the apartment. It had access to my life, to my connections, to my very identity. It was not just a prank. It was a malicious, intelligent entity, and it was toying with my mind. I retreated to my bedroom, barricading the door with a chair and a small dresser. I sat there in the flickering candlelight, my phone flashlight a small, trembling beacon, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That's when I heard it. The sound of my front door, the one I had locked with a deadbolt, slowly creaking open. The footsteps were inside now, too fast, too light, and they were moving with purpose towards my room. The candles in the room began to flicker wildly, the flames dancing and swaying as if a wind was blowing through the apartment. The doorknob to my bedroom began to rattle, a soft, deliberate turning of the handle. Then, the impossibly fast footsteps stopped just outside my door, followed by a loud, single thud against the wood. The sound was not a human fist. It was a solid, percussive impact that made the entire door shudder. The wood began to splinter around the hinges, and I knew with a profound, soul-shattering certainty that whatever was on the other side of that door was not a person. I saw a long, impossibly thin shadow slide under the door, a shape that didn't correspond to a human foot. It was a claw, a black spindly appendage that was searching for an opening dot in a blind panic. I scrambled out of my chair, shoved a window open, and climbed out onto the small fire escape, several stories above the dark city. I stayed there for hours, shaking, a terrified island in the pitch black, until the first lights of the city began to flicker back on, one by one. The building's emergency lights came on, then the power returned to the apartments. Emergency services found me there, a shell-shocked wreck. I never returned to that apartment. The experience left me with an intense, crippling fear of the dark and of being alone. The sound of a sudden thud, a whisper in an empty room, a quick movement in the periphery of my vision, they all bring me back to that night. I know now that some things can only exist in the absence of light, and they are always waiting for the next blackout. The sound of a simple power outage is no longer a sound of inconvenience to me. It's the sound of a key turning in a lock. People romanticize winter storms, the snow falling in soft drifts, the warmth of a fire, the feeling of being cut off from the world in a cozy cabin. We felt that for a few hours. But that night, the storm wasn't just outside the cabin, it was in the cabin. The blackout was a blanket of profound quiet, and the storm was its voice, a howling, malicious voice that was trying to tell us what was happening to our friend. We thought the blizzard was a wall meant to keep us in. We didn't realize it was a disguise meant to let something else get in. My name is Jake, and a few years ago, my friends and Maria, David, and Sarah rented a remote cabin in the mountains for a weekend getaway. It was the kind of place you see in movies: logs, a huge stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a snow-covered forest. The forecast had called for a blizzard, but we were young and stupid, and we saw it as an adventure, a chance to really disconnect from the world. We had plenty of food, plenty of whiskey, and a roaring fire in the hearth. The mood was jovial, a perfect escape from our chaotic city lives. The snow began to fall as promised, and with it, a low, constant hum of the wind. The world outside began to disappear under a swirling blanket of white. Then, just as the last vestiges of daylight faded, the power went out. The world went silent, and the cabin was plunged into a deeper darkness, lit only by the flickering flames of the fire and the candles we hurried to light. The first hint of a problem wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling. We were all laughing and talking, but a tense quiet had fallen over us. That's when we heard it. A frantic, desperate banging on the front door, a heavy, insistent series of impacts that made us all freeze. Who would be out here in this storm? My friend David, being the most pragmatic of our group, grabbed a flashlight and went to the door. We all watched as he unlocked the deadbolt and slowly, cautiously opened it. The wind and snow immediately lashing into the cabin, but there was nothing there. Just a swirling, blinding mass of white. No person, no footprints, nothing. David stood there for a moment, confused, then slammed the door shut, locking it tight. We all tried to rationalize it: a loose shutter, a heavy branch, but the sound had been too deliberate, too much like someone begging to be let in. The first seed of doubt, of fear, had been planted. The weirdness escalated slowly. Our friend Sarah, who had been the most excited about the blizzard, began to act strange. She became withdrawn and quiet, staring out the huge picture window at the swirling snow. When we tried to talk to her, she just muttered, "It's out there. I can see it." We looked, but all we saw was a beautiful, terrifying curtain of white. We tried to laugh it off, saying it was just cabin fever, but she was convinced. She claimed she could see shapes in the blizzard, things that looked vaguely human but moved too fast, too erratically. The other friends dismissed it, but I started to believe her when the sounds began again. We were all gathered around the fireplace, trying to stay warm, when we heard a new sound, a loud, rhythmic scratching on the roof. It was followed by a soft, insistent tapping on the window pane right next to us. The tapping wasn't random, it was a pattern. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. It was trying to get our attention, and it was doing it with a frightening intelligence. The fear shifted from a general unease to a specific, targeted terror. One of my friends, Maria, let out a blood-curdling scream and pointed at the window. The rest of us turned our heads, and in the space between 2 fierce gusts of snow, we saw it. A large, dark shape, a silhouette of a person standing just outside the window, its form barely visible against the swirling white. It was impossibly tall, its limbs were long and thin, and as we stared at it, we saw its head was tilted at an impossible angle. Its shape was a grotesque parody of a person, a twisted reflection. It didn't have a face, but as Maria screamed, the shape seemed to turn its head directly toward her. The tapping on the window became frantic, a desperate staccato that mirrored her terrified shriek. We all huddled together, paralyzed with fear, as the thing seemed to watch us from the heart of the storm. The scratching on the walls and roof intensified, becoming a frantic, desperate clawing sound, as if a wild animal with razor-sharp talons was trying to break in. The tapping on the windows turned into a solid, insistent banging that shook the glass in its frame. It felt like the cabin was under a physical assault, a siege by something unseen and incredibly powerful. Sarah, who had been muttering all night, stood up and walked to the front door. We all looked at her, terrified. She put her hand on the doorknob, and a strange, wet clicking sound came from her mouth. "Sarah, no," David screamed, but it was too late. She was trying to open the door, trying to let the thing in. We rushed her, pulling her away from the door, but she resisted with an unnatural strength, and she began to scratch at the wood of the door with her fingernails. The sound a horrific echo of the scratching we were hearing from outside. She was no longer Sarah. She was a puppet, and the storm was the puppeteer. We were huddled in a corner of the cabin, holding Sarah down as she thrashed and writhed, scratching at the floor, a manic gleam in her eyes. The scratching and banging outside reached a fever pitch, a deafening assault on the cabin walls and windows. The fire in the hearth began to die down, and the cabin was plunged into a deeper darkness. The sounds from outside suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any noise. We then heard a new sound, the distinct, violent crack of the front door, splintering under an immense unseen force. The door groaned, the wood splintered, and a long, impossibly thin, clawed hand slid through the crack. Its fingers tapped against the air, searching, feeling, probing for a way in. In a last-ditch effort, David grabbed a lit candle and threw it at the clawed hand. The thing hissed, a wet, guttural sound, and withdrew the hand. That was all the chance we needed. We scrambled out the back door, leaving Sarah screaming and scratching at the floor, her eyes wide and unseeing, a prisoner of whatever had gotten into her. We found the snowmobile, started it up, and drove 4 hours through the blizzard, not stopping until we reached a roadside motel with lights. We never returned to that cabin. We were rescued, but not whole. We are forever haunted by the memory of our friend and the sounds that came from the storm. We know now that a blizzard isn't just a weather event. It's a cover, a weapon used by something ancient and cruel to find its way into the world. And we know that somewhere in that cabin, a part of our friend is still trapped, a prisoner of the darkness.